Troy Trojan Vision presents the 2016 campaign, featuring political science experts from the Troy University faculty with an in-depth look at the 2016 presidential campaign. This episode's panel includes Dr. Stephen L. Taylor, an expert in electoral and comparative politics as well as Latin American politics. He is the author of 3 books. Dr. Taylor's most recent book, A Different Democracy, American Government in a 31-Country Perspective, was published by the Yale University Press in 2014. He is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Troy University. Dr. Mariam Stevenson specializes in American politics and immigration law. She has a PhD from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and a JD from the University of Memphis. She is currently working on a book manuscript on immigration. She is assistant professor of political science at Troy University. The moderator is Dr. Michael O. Slobodchikoff, who specializes in relations between Russia and the former Soviet states, international conflict and peace, and comparative politics. He is the author of 2 books. His most recent book, Building Hegemonic Order Russia's Way, Rule Stability and Predictability in a Post-Soviet Space, was published in 2014. He is a regular contributor to Russia Direct and has often served as an analyst on Russian relations with Ukraine for BBC World News, as well as Voice of Russia Radio. He is an assistant professor of political science at Troy University.
Every 4 years, Americans celebrate the democratic process of electing their president. This is their chance to have their voices heard while choosing who will best represent their interests. On February 1st, 2016, the Iowa Caucuses will be held, which will kick off the process of determining which candidate will represent his or her respective party in the election. While candidates have been campaigning and debating each other for several months already, the Iowa Caucuses signals the true start of choosing the next leader. To help us understand this election period, we are joined by Dr. Stephen L. Taylor on my left and Dr. Mariam Stevenson on my right from the Department of Political Science at Troy University. Thank you both for joining us on this panel today. I'd like to turn to Dr. Taylor first and say that currently there are 12 candidates vying to represent the Republican Party and 3 candidates competing to represent the Democratic Party in the election. Can you explain the process of determining who will represent his or her party?
Sure. We have a unique system in the United States. If you look globally, for other places that have presidents, plenty of places that have presidents but don't have this kind of system, where instead of having a national process by which we choose a candidate for each major party, we go at a state-by-state process where candidates compete for delegates at the state level and to select a certain number of delegates to represent them at a convention that will be held this summer. And the candidates able to acquire for each party a majority of the delegates will be nominated for their parties in those conventions so they can then run in the general election campaign in the fall. So we're in an election this year, the cycle in which there's an open seat, there's no incumbent running, there's no vice president running, so there's no necessarily clear candidate for either party. So both parties have a large number of candidates, especially the Republican Party, with, as you know, well over a dozen candidates running. Democrats have less, but still a number of candidates competing. And they're going to start off this process in Iowa to try to win the caucuses in Iowa to acquire a certain number of delegates and also, perhaps more importantly, to acquire a certain level of media attention and also internal attention from their partisans as they move forward in the process.
Okay. Now, I understand you used both caucuses when talking about the Iowa caucuses and primaries when you were talking about some of the states. Dr. Stevenson, what is the difference between a caucus and a primary? We hear both those terms used.
Yeah, both terms are used interchangeably. The current system that we operate under today has been in place since the 1970s. And essentially, each party in each state has the option of selecting whether or not they want to use a caucus system or a primary system in order to select their nominee. And essentially, the way in which the two work, about 14 states utilize 14 states plus Washington, D.C. utilize the caucus system. The rest of the states utilize a primary. The primary system is, I guess, a little bit more preferred by the states because the primary system is both paid for and run by the states, whereas the caucus system is paid for and run by the party. So it's a little bit more, I guess, palatable to the parties in each state to allow the state to pay for those activities. Now, on a procedural level, the primary operates just like any other election would. The voters show up to vote, they place to a polling station, they vote, they place a ballot, and that's the end of it. The primary can either be an open primary or it can be a closed primary, or some type of variation. So essentially, voters will either have to be in a closed primary, either be a registered member of the party, or in an open election, they can be an unaffiliated voter. In a caucus, however, the process is a little bit different. The voters show up to various meetings, if you will, around the state, and they will hear from speakers on behalf of the candidates. And then at that point, they will place their vote. So the caucus process is a little bit lengthier. It requires a little bit more political sophistication. So for that reason, voter turnout tends to be a lot lower in the states that utilize the caucuses as opposed to the primaries.
Okay, good, okay. And so, as I mentioned earlier, on February 1st, the Iowa Caucuses will be held. It's the first caucus. So how important is Iowa really to choosing the eventual nominee?
Well, in the grand scheme of things, the number of delegates that are assigned in Iowa is quite small. So I think it's just over 1% of the delegates will be decided in Iowa. However, since at least 1976, the Iowa caucus has been considered significant as the first in the nation of these contests. And so it really is it's a time for the media to focus very heavily on these candidates, and for candidates to demonstrate whether they have at least some level of viability or not, by demonstrating that they can finish at least at a respectable place, especially when you have as many candidates as we currently have, right? The Republican side, with all the candidates that are running, the ability to come in first, second, or third, rather than 10th, will matter considerably in terms of perception. It's also because, as Dr. Stevenson describes, it's a more complicated process. It's a more time-limited process. People have to show up in certain places at night in the cold and all that. It's also a test of organizational skill. Can the campaigns get their supporters out to the caucus locations? And this is, for example, this year, one very interesting question is, can Donald Trump, who is a newcomer to this kind of campaigning, will he be able to mobilize supporters in this regard? And so how he finishes versus the more seasoned politicians will say a lot about his capacity to move forward. It will also trigger lots of either positive or negative press over the next couple of days.
And I know that, speaking of the press, that the press has made a lot of prognostications and talked a lot about what could eventually happen. So the press, one of the things that the press has been reporting is that it might be difficult to determine a nominee, especially in the Republican Party, given that there are so many contenders. And so they've reported that a brokered convention might be a possibility. What would happen if there's no obvious nominee, and do you think this might actually happen?
The way it works, as I said a while back, is that the candidates have to acquire, to be nominated, the candidate has to acquire over 50% of the delegates that will attend the Republican convention. We'll speak about the Republicans for a moment. Same rule for the Democrats. But because the Republican side is currently so large, and because there's all this contention between, say, the Trump side and the more traditional political side of the party, some have speculated about it, what would be called the brokered convention, which would mean that we would reach the convention in the summer. Nobody would have a majority of the delegates, and so there would have to be a deal brokered is the basic idea. We usually have this speculation every 4 years. Someone talks about, hey, we might have a brokered convention. We haven't had brokered convention since well before the current era, as Dr. Stevenson pointed out. We started this current process of selecting delegates through primaries and caucuses in the 70s. Since that time, we've never even come close to a brokered convention. And the way it's structured, it starts kind of slowly, but by March, it's going pretty rapidly. And there are several days in which there are lots of contests, and people will start to drop out. And so the odds of there being a brokered convention are pretty much zero. I mean, in theory, anything can happen. In reality, it's highly unlikely.
Okay. The press has also reported that Bernie Sanders has significantly narrowed the gap with Hillary Clinton, both in Iowa and New Hampshire. And they are reporting that it might be possible, actually, after New Hampshire, to get the necessary momentum, as we were just talking about, to actually beat Hillary Clinton. Do you think that that's possible, since she lost the way she did in 2008 to Obama? Is it possible that that could happen again? I'll open that up to either one of you.
Anything's certainly possible. Hillary Clinton certainly has had a significant amount of momentum, and I think that most pundits would have agreed up until early this year that she was the likely contender for the Democratic nomination. As you mentioned, Bernie Sanders has certainly been gaining momentum recently, and as you mentioned, the press has certainly heaped a lot of attention on Bernie Sanders. The thing to keep in mind is momentum is key in any election, as Dr. Taylor mentioned earlier, and a lot is going to depend on the early primaries and caucuses, how well he does, whether or not he's able to actually keep the momentum going for the long haul, or is this just a temporary bump? It's a little too early to tell at this point. If he's able to keep the current momentum going, I would say he has a fairly good shot. But that said, Hillary Clinton has a lot of name recognition. She has a lot of money backing her, and she has momentum as well. So I think it would be a difficult seat to, a difficult place to overtake. But anything's possible. And there's always a possibility of an October surprise in the primaries. So we'll see.
I think what'll be interesting to watch, right? Senator Sanders should do well in New Hampshire. We already see the polling is pretty tight, and there is a tradition where candidates from New England tend to do well in New Hampshire. The challenge for Sanders is going south, right? One, will he have sufficient support of African American voters will be very important in the Democratic primaries, which Secretary Clinton has a pretty good connection with at this point.
In South Carolina especially?
Yeah, in South Carolina. I mean, these are old. Polling, everyone should understand, right? Polling in primaries is difficult. So things can change rapidly. And the polling that I've seen for South Carolina is on the old side. However, the gap is tremendous. The polls that I saw yesterday were like a 40-point gap between Sanders and Clinton, with Clinton on top. Now, that may not be totally accurate, but that's still substantial. And really, Senator Sanders, I think, does generate some excitement. He's clearly passionate about his positions. By the same token, he is a self-identified socialist, and these words matter, right? Even though we could have a whole discussion about what that means, and it means various things. It is a difficult term in American politics to overcome, and really also the degree to which he's very associated with New England. How well does that travel south, and how well does it travel west? And that becomes a real question. But it certainly makes for an interesting contest at this point.
So do you think that a lot of this is the media just trying to drum up interest then? Or is this more that this could be actually a real phenomenon? in either case, in either the brokered convention or Bernie Sanders closing the gap with Hillary?
I think at this point, well, definitely with regard to the brokered convention, this is something, as Dr. Taylor said, every 4 years we see talk of a brokered convention. This is nothing new. We, as Americans, we tend to have short memories, and we tend to see the same types of things cycle through every election cycle, and this is no example. So this is no exception. So I don't. I think with regard to the brokered convention, I agree with Dr. Taylor in that this is just the media trying to drum up, some viewership and get excitement among their viewers. With regard to Senator Sanders, I think it's a little bit of a different situation because we've seen a little bit of a shift with regard to the polls, with regard to how the American public has kind of viewed him over time, and there's been, as Dr. Taylor mentioned, there's been more support shifted towards Senator Sanders. So I don't think that the two topics are necessarily synonymous. I think there's a little bit of merit to that one, but again, I think it's going to be very difficult for him to overcome the momentum and the backing that the Secretary Clinton has.
I think without a doubt. I mean, all of these stories, to one degree or another, is the cable news in particular, but the media in general, trying to find something to talk about, right? Because really, if you want to be honest about it, there's been nothing new in this process for months, yet we hear news stories every day because they have to have something to talk about on television. Because I don't really think that the fundamentals or dynamics of this race have really shifted all that much for months, to be totally honest. And I still think that if I were going to lay money, I would lay money heavily that Secretary Clinton, or Senator Clinton, would be nominated, and the Republican side's a little harder. I still think it'll probably be Rubio, maybe Cruz. I don't think Trump's going to, but we can talk more about that. But right now, there's no data, right? We had no votes have not been cast. The polling is difficult. One of the things that's hard for people that actually pay attention to politics to believe is that there are a substantial number of people who actually make up their minds at the very last minute. So especially in nomination races. So a lot of this is trying to find something to talk about and trying to make it more dramatic. Okay. Because really, again, with the Sanders-Clinton dynamic, could Sanders, if he does find some kind of toehold in the South and African-American voters that we're unaware of, could that make him more competitive over time? Certainly. The likelihood is that it's going to be difficult to do that. But that's boring to say on the news. It's more interesting to say that it's, because if you look at the New Hampshire numbers, they're very close. But New Hampshire's not South Carolina. Right. And South Carolina's not, the rest of the Super Tuesday states that are going to come in early March or whatever the case may be. Okay. So, yeah, a lot of it is hype.
Okay.
I was just going to mention also the one thing that the poll numbers don't capture, however, is it has increasingly become more difficult for pollsters and for the media to capture younger voters. Mm-hmm. And we know that younger voters tend to have lower voter turnout rates. However, polling has not caught up with technology yet, and so most polling is still conducted via telephone and landlines. And what do we know about who actually has landlines? Mm-hmm. Older voters. So we're not capturing a large demographic of or a demographic of voters. So that kind of throws a little bit of a wrench into the situation as well.
Okay, good. Now, Dr. Stevenson, I know you're an immigration expert. And immigration has been raised as an issue from early on, from Donald Trump talking about a wall being built and keeping out Mexicans who he called rapists, I believe, and murderers. To
just some of them.
Just some of them, exactly. To more recently talking about Syrian refugees escaping the crisis. How serious an issue do you envision immigration being, and do you think it'll increase in seriousness as we go along in the election cycle?
Well, immigration is an issue that has certainly been at the forefront of elections in the past several election cycles. This is captured by the fact that I think it was 2 years ago, the Gallup poll for the first time was able to capture the fact that for the first time, Americans viewed immigration as being one of the top 5 most important problems facing the United States. So increasingly, as undocumented immigration continues to increase, coming off of the heels of an economic recession, high unemployment, etc., it kind of has created and fostered this political environment that has not been largely favorable towards immigration. And so as a result, the issue has become an important one in politics. If you look at the candidates' positions, particularly within the Republican Party, if you look at the candidates' positions on immigration over time, even in just a short period since announcing their candidacies, a lot of them have already flip-flopped on the issue of immigration. Mm-hmm. So particularly within the Republican Party, I wouldn't be surprised if individually the candidates will continue to not bring immigration up as a topic in the forefront of discussion. However, I think it is a topic that the American people want to hear about, and I think it will certainly be a larger topic during the general election. I think it will be a major topic between the candidates for the two parties, certainly during the major presidential debates. But I think, at least on the, I would say at least on the Republican side, I would not be surprised if it was an issue that the candidates kind of stepped away from a little bit. At least the main candidates, we've already seen Rubio flip-flop. He was a major sponsor. He was an original member of the Gang of Eight, comprehensive immigration reform legislation, and he's already flip-flopped on a lot of those positions. So it's an area that is a little bit sticky for the candidates, for most of the Republican candidates. We've seen flip-flopping also with regard to the Democratic candidates. And flip-flopping is something that the American public doesn't usually like to see. So I wouldn't be surprised, again, if this was an issue that they tried to stay away from, if they possibly can, over the course of the next couple of months. But again, we'll see. But I think it's going to play a larger role in the general campaign rather than in the primaries.
Okay, good. So now we get to the point in our program where we actually test how much we understand in the process. Mm. And I want to ask each of you for your predictions as to who will be the Republican nominee and who will be the Democratic nominee.
Well, I already tipped my hand, right? So I think that Secretary Clinton, will clearly be nominated by the Democrats. I think barring some October surprise, to use the vernacular, something truly dramatic, I think that's a pretty safe bet. The Republicans are trickier, right? The question right now is really how to assess the Trump phenomenon, right? Because Trump is clearly leading in polls, but how will he do in these really the first 3 or 4 contests? Will he come in? Right now the polling has him coming in second in Iowa, but first in New Hampshire. Cruz is coming in first in in Iowa, but Rubio's coming in second. These things, all these first, second, third things matter. And then, can Trump take this message to the South and be successful? Can he appeal to evangelical voters and social conservatives? I think that part of what's going on right now is with so many candidates, the numbers are split. And some of these people cannot persevere. Ben Carson, Jeb Bush, Kasich, these fellows are going to have to drop out at some point, almost certainly, unless there's an amazing resurgence in the next couple of weeks. And those numbers have to go someplace. Now, I think they're probably going to go to a more traditional candidate than the Trump. I think if you're a Trump supporter, you're in the Trump camp. If you don't like Trump, you're someplace else. And so I think we're going to see a coalescence around a sort of not Trump or a more traditional politician. I think Marco Rubio has more of a shot at that over the long haul than does Ted Cruz, because Ted Cruz is in some ways not, he's still kind of positioning himself as a little bit of an outsider. So I guess if I had to lay money, but I wouldn't want to lay a lot, I would say Rubio, because the rest of the candidates, everyone who thought that Jeb Bush was going to be the nominee, he's been almost invisible, and he has money, but I don't know that he can.
Low energy.
Yeah, so I've been told. Whether he can resuscitate himself, doesn't seem likely.
Okay.
So if Clinton for certain, I would say, and then I would hedge and say probably Rubio, but that's my guess.
Okay.
And it's a guess.
Dr. Stevenson?
I agree with that assessment. I think Hillary Clinton is a good bet on the Democratic side. I think on the Republican side, as Dr. Taylor mentioned, it's a little bit trickier. I think the answer that I want to give is that it's too early to tell. But I guess a gun to my head, if I had to give a response, I agree with Dr. Taylor's assessment in that I think that Rubio has the momentum, the backing, the support that's going to be necessary for the long haul through at least April, which is when we'll likely know 75% of the delegates will be known by April 26th, by the end of April. So I think barring some type of October surprise or something else, some major scandal, gun to my head, I would say Rubio.
Okay. And do you think Rubio has a chance then to beat Clinton?
The electoral math is tricky. I mean, if you sit down, you play with the Electoral College, and you look at what Democrats and Republicans won the last go round, and it is difficult, more difficult for Republicans. They have to win some states some pretty big states that they have had trouble winning recently. So a chance, certainly. I think it's still going to be a harder road than perhaps for the Democrats. So I mean, if I'm betting, I'm betting on the President Clinton in terms of probabilities. But again, there's a lot of territory between now and then.
Okay.
I think Rubio has a lot of deficits that he's going to have to overcome. I think a lot is going to depend on who the Republicans, or who, assuming it is Rubio, who he selects as a vice president. I think that selection is going to be a lot more important than Clinton's selection. I think that Rubio could potentially garner a lot of support from minorities and take some of those independent voters away from Clinton, where maybe another Republican couldn't do so. So I think that's an interesting element to keep in mind. But I agree. I think he has a harder road ahead of him than Clinton does. But it's certainly, again, too early to tell.
So come November and then January, when the oath of office is taken, we might actually have another President Clinton. So it's possible. So
Anything's possible.
Anything's possible. So, well, I want to thank you both very much for helping to illuminate what is a very complicated process and complex process, and one that still confuses a lot of people who honestly follow this more readily than others, and certainly those who don't. So thank you very much for joining us today and helping us understand the process.
To view this and other Troy Trojan Vision programs online, check out our YouTube page at youtube.com/Troy Trojan Vision. To find out when new programs are uploaded, like us on Facebook.